Good afternoon, everyone. Before we get started, my name is Jose Aranda. I work in the library. I'm a colleague of Susan Bontley's and also our interim library director, Therese DeSimio, is joining us as well, and she'll be manning the chat for the files and any questions you may have. Just a couple tips, please turn off your microphones until we entertain questions, and you can also use the chat box for those questions as well. This is being recorded, so if you miss something or if you want to review any information, just remember that this will be recorded and made available to you and everyone else shortly. Let's get started. Susan Bontley created these research workshops, and there's 4 of them. So this is number 3, evaluating. The other 2 have also been recorded and are available through our website. Our contact information is up at the right-hand corner of this slide. Our Espina and our East Mesa campus, our general library email, our website, our phone numbers, strategies for successful research. Number 3, evaluation. Today's objectives are going to be identifying what types of sources are available, using tools to evaluate them, and checking for bias. Here are some handouts. We'll review the first 3 in general through this presentation. The 4th one, the guided notes, is something Susan created where you can follow as I'm presenting, and there are spaces, blank spaces, where you would then write in keywords, key terms that we're covering to help you engage with the material. The guided notes are meant to help you follow along as I present, and then everything else will be covered in the presentation. Oh yes, if you are attending for extra credit, please let us know which professor you belong to. This is kind of an outline of these workshops that Susan created. So there are 4 workshops, and this is kind of an outline of the curriculum of these workshops. Today's step 4, how to evaluate your resources. So we began with identifying a topic and then doing preliminary research and then locating those materials. And now we're going to talk about evaluating. And so the last workshop will cover those last steps there that you see. And here's a graphic to help you better understand where we stand. Today's focus is going to be on how to identify the sources that you're going to consider using for your assignments and research needs, and how to evaluate them and check for biases. You can see steps 5 through 7 at our next workshop. So we represent the library, and of course we have many traditional resources available to you. Most commonly are the books and journals and magazines that you may see as you browse our shelves when we were open, but we also have many of them and others in electronic format. I myself have done several presentations in the last year or so on some of those resources, such as electronic books, ebooks, journal articles, databases, and other resources that the library subscribes to that you have then access. If you go through our website, or if you ask us, we can direct you to the page that has all those recordings and supplemental information. But in general, these are, for the most part, the types of resources students seek when doing research. So there are print resources, and then there are electronic, and then of course there's web-based, right? The internet. So those are, in general, the types of sources that most students use for research. If you do more specialized research, such as genealogy or local history, for example, you may then be using like personal interviews or oral histories, things of that nature. You could also use like primary sources, but those are like more specialized research topics. We can help you with those as well. But in general, these are the basic, more popular types of resources more students will seek in these assignments. To go over some of them, print. If you visit the library, you'll see shelves and shelves of books. Some of those books are ones you can check out. They circulate, and then others you cannot. And the ones you cannot tend to be the more reference types of books. They tend to be more expensive, bigger, They're referenced because you normally would use them to look up information rather quickly. So like encyclopedias, dictionaries, handbooks, those are examples of some reference books that do not circulate. And then there are periodicals, which include our magazines and our journals. Magazines you are probably familiar with, the popular ones, right? The ones you see at Walmart, at the airport, the doctor's offices. Then there are research journals, professional journals. Those are different. So nonetheless, they're still excellent resources for research. So those are some examples of the print. And then some of the examples of our electronic resources are our databases. And so you see there are pictures of several of them. EBSCO, Gale, very popular databases that we have. And those are the companies, and they have several different types of databases that are subject specific. They're geared towards a specific area, for example, psychology or nursing, or they can be general databases, right? Academic Search Premier is an example of a general database. And then we have ebooks, electronic books. So keep that in mind when you are entertaining a research topic and an assignment. Just know that both exist. We can help you find them in either one that you prefer. That's what it boils down to, is what you prefer. Some of us prefer, the print, but right now that may not be possible. So we have supplements to help you with that in the electronic format. What is a periodical? A periodical is basically a publication that comes out every so often. If you think of the newspaper that could come out every day, right? Newspaper. Certain magazines come out either once a week, like Time magazine, Newsweek, or every month, like People magazine, National Geographic. And then there are popular magazines, and then there are academic, also known as scholarly sources. And those are your journals. So you see there are a couple of pictures of those examples. What I like to highlight when I talk to students about what the differences are, the main difference is the popular sources, your magazines, for example, are mostly written by journalists and editors and are written for the mass audience, right? Mass appeal. And your academic or scholarly journals are written by experts, people that are highly qualified to write about that subject. Many times they have advanced degrees in that area, and they have experience doing research. They've sent their research findings to these publishers of these journals that are very reputable in their field, and they vet their submissions, their articles, through what is called a peer-reviewed process. They have a board, for lack of a better word, they have a board or a committee that reviews the submissions and evaluates it on the merits of academic standards or whatever standards they use in their fields. So whereas in the popular magazines, it's a journalist and an editor. In the academic or scholarly arena, many times they do a blind review, meaning the members of the committee don't even know who is submitting the research articles. They just read and give their opinions about its merits that way. So it's a more scholarly process, if you will. That's the main difference. There are others, but that's the main difference. As a student, you need to know what the requirements are when your instructor assigns something of this nature to you. What are the requirements? What is the instructor telling you that you must use? Are they saying you need to have scholarly sources, or at least one? So this is where you should know the difference. Okay, I could have 3 sources or 4, but one has to be a scholarly, and hopefully now you know what it is. So this slide talks more about identifying a peer-reviewed. The previous slide where I was talking about the scholarly process of how there's that committee that reviews research articles and its submissions. That's called peer-reviewed. So members of that committee are peers, meaning they're equally qualified as those that wrote the article. So they too have advanced degrees, experience, may have written, et cetera, et cetera. Unlike, it's a different scenario than the journalist and the editor relationship that I'm sure many of us have seen in TV or movies. This is different. So the committee that makes up the review process is a peer-reviewed process, or peer-reviewed journal is another way of calling these academic or scholarly sources. And you don't see these journals at the airport or at Walmart. Where do you see them? you'll see them mostly at academic libraries, or if institutions other than academic libraries subscribe to them, like a research lab or government, they may have individual subscriptions to these journals, and they too then can have a subscription and have those delivered. So maybe at a doctor's office, you may have seen the Journal of American Medical Association or something similar to that. I know I have been to other medical specialists in town, and I've seen journals there. Here are some questions you can use to guide yourself in identifying some of these academic, more scholarly sources. Is it written by a scholar? What is it about? Who's the audience? How is it structured? How is it written? And what's the publication type? Is it written by a scholar? I mentioned most of these articles, these research articles, include or are part of original research. The authors of themselves have established credentials. Chances are they wouldn't be doing that type of research if they didn't. So they're either hired by an institution, an employer to do that type of work. You can be work for the government or something like that, an academic institution such as a university. And those authors are clearly identified, and many times their credentials are listed or are easily researched. Whereas in the popular magazines, for example, that's usually a journalist, and they too have their own standards, but many times their credentials are not as visible, or they may not be experts in the field. They're just a good writer that so happens to be writing about that topic. Not always, right? Some journalists are specialists. So there's some gray area in between those. So when you're evaluating sources, finding out who it's written by, who the authors are, is an important criteria. What is it about? So, like I mentioned earlier, the popular magazines tend to publish for the mass audience, right? For most people. And so the newspaper, the local newspaper versus national newspaper, there's some difference there too. There's also cost as a factor of that, and circulation if it's available. But for the most part, academic sources are written for anyone that's interested in the field, which usually is not the mass audience. It's not the general public. There are individuals in the public that have an interest and thus have a subscription. For example, I have a hobby in history, so I am a member of the American History Association, and because of that membership, I then get its journal publication. But I'm not a PhD, I don't do original research, I don't publish, so I just happen to have the subscription. So that's how I'm able to see that journal. But for the most part, you have to have intention to subscribe to that source. And those sources, those scholarly journals, academic research journals, are well known in the community, and there's many of them. But once you're involved in that subject area, say chemistry or anthropology, and you study and you have advanced degrees in that, you then by that time are aware of what are the more popular, more common, most cited journals in that field. So that's how the popularity of those sources increase and get promoted. Whereas the mass publications of the magazines that you see at Walmart and the airport are massively promoted and marketed, right, to the mass audience. So the articles you're going to find in these journals are going to be very specific. Okay, because most of the time they're going to be writing about their research. So keep that in mind. The audiences, I think I've talked about what some of those characteristics are. How is it structured? The journal articles are more technical and they have more specific language that's pertinent to the subject area that they're writing about, unlike the other popular sources that are going to be more appealing to the mass audience, and it may be written at a specific grade level. Example. How is it written? The popular magazines tend to be shorter in length. I mean, you may have feature articles in Time Magazine and Newsweek that are several pages long, but for the most part, they're under a page, maybe a couple pages at max. Whereas the articles found in journals, in academic peer-reviewed journals, are very lengthy. They can be anywhere from 10 pages to 50 pages. It all depends. They don't have that consideration in mind. They're not limited by space, whereas in the mass publications they would be. So, and also other characteristics that differentiate them. The articles written, journals have references, have footnotes, have endnotes, which we've talked about in these, or will talk about in these presentations. And as librarians, we promote in general, right? You always want to cite your sources and give credit, and there's different citation styles that provide different ways of doing that. So footnotes and endnotes are examples of those. Whereas the mass publications tend to not. I mean, journalistic integrity is incorporated in how they write their articles, right? So they do identify some of their sources or when they're interviewing someone, but it's not cited exactly like it would be in an academic source where it's very, very obvious and purposely done. The last point is appearance. Popular magazines and those types are going to be prettier with lots of colors and pictures, and probably the opposite is true as well for the journals. They may have graphics, charts, and some pictures, but for the most part, their objective is to showcase their research in a written format. And like I mentioned earlier, they're not limited by space, so they're going to be very extensive and detailed. A lot of information there on how to distinguish between them. We'll take a break at this time, entertain comments or questions. So a lot of times students ask, well, can I use the internet? Or instructors are vague about what they will and will not accept from the internet. So make sure you clear this with your instructor if it is not written in the instructions or the directions. They may say something like, do not use the internet. And that's a very broad statement because many of our electronic resources that I was mentioning earlier about ebooks and databases, those live in the internet. You need the internet to access them. The instructions need to be clear. So make sure you bring those up with your instructor and the assignment. They may limit what you can use if they do allow you to use the internet. So they may say you can use websites, but they can only be from educational sources, or they can only be from government sources, for example. .coms tend to be the websites that almost anyone can publish that has the means to publish, okay? So let's go back. The other example I was talking about, the popular magazines and the journal and the scholarly academic journals, both those sources, have criteria, and they're not just going to publish anything, right? They're going to solicit input and articles from whomever, journalists, researchers, or experts, but they still go through a process to get vetted because it's their name and reputation that's online if they don't. Whereas the internet, if you just have a couple of bucks and you know a thing or two about how to publish something online, you can create a website that could be accessible by anyone. .coms tend to be more of those types of websites that more instructors then would be skeptical about their students using. We at the library teach you how to search specifically for those types of resources. Let's say you only want websites that come from academic sources. And so we can teach you on how to use Google, for example, and searching only .edu websites or organizational websites or government websites. So just keep those in mind. And Susan is referring here in this slide that there's a handout on using Google, for example, that can help you with that. The point to consider anytime using a source, but specifically the internet, is it credible and is it reliable? Those are questions that you should always be asking about all your sources, but particularly the ones on the internet, because there's a lot of false information online. There's a lot of misinformation and there's a lot of disinformation. There's a lot of information that's just not accurate, and there's a lot of information that's purposefully inaccurate. We got to keep that in mind when we're using the internet. So that's why you have to evaluate them. We'll discuss what to look for, why it's important, and how you can use this. So there's this continuum, right, between credible and credibility. And this graph, it's adapted from a website called Evaluating Sources. The credibility of your assignment rests on the credibility of the resources you're going to use in your research and in your writing. So make sure that you consider your resources before you start your assignment, and of course, before you start your writing. And these are some of the criteria and factors to keep in mind. How current is it? Is it too old? Is it too new? How accurate is it? Is it biased? Is it credible? Is it authoritative? Is it citing credible resources? And what is the intended audience? And what's their purpose too, is probably another one that we can consider here. A lot of factors that you should be asking as you evaluate some of these resources, and we can help you do that. There is a CRaap test that's popular, available online. If you Google that, you should be able to get it. It's a checklist that kind of helps you to guide how credible the resource you're referring to is. So C stands for currency. How old is it? For a history class and a history assignment, currency, you'll probably want to focus a resource that's current in whatever era you're researching. If it's really old, right? If it's from the 18th or 19th century, then people are constantly researching and writing things about that era. So currency may not be that big of a deal. But if it's something really current, let's say this COVID-19, science is still unsure about everything about this disease that is prevalent in this pandemic. So they're doing lots of research right now. So it hasn't come out yet. If you pick a topic like that, just know that you will have to, or you should get resources that are very recent, because the information may be changing dramatically. Another example would be like some of the sciences, physics. I heard once that the knowledge of physics doubles every 7 to 10 years, something like that. An area like physics or some other area may have a lot of current knowledge written about it and new information that replaces old information. So if you have an article that's 10 years old, it may not be valid anymore. So that's what currency is about. Keep in mind about how relevant, how current is the resource you're considering. Are relevant. Is it relevant to your topic? And this was discussed the last presentation about what your thesis statement should be, what topic you're following under, and how you're going to branch it into your assignment or argument, for example. So you want to make sure that the resources you consult are very relevant to your topic. They support what you're trying to say. Authority, we've talked about this already. Who are the authors? Can you research them? Can you find out what their credentials are? Can you find out what they've already written? Are they experts in the field? If you come across a website that you cannot find who the author is, that should be a red flag. Okay. You should wonder why they're not disclosing who the author of that page is. Also, the date. If you can't find the date, you should wonder why. These should be red flags. These should be factors for you to consider. The other A is for accuracy. Okay, how do you find out if something's accurate? Well, in the research process, you're supposed to be reading a variety of resources on the topic and subtopics that you should rather quickly, and also through the use of reference books such as encyclopedias, have a basic foundation of the topic that you're researching about. And if you're finding the same information repeated in many of those resources, that's a good indication. That's called cross-referencing. You're finding the same information in various resources. Whereas, let's say you find a website that has this crazy idea that you've never heard about. You've been reading about whatever topic you're on, and then you come across this website that throws this monkey wrench in the whole thing. That should be a red flag. You can't substantiate it through any other resource that you've consulted. That should be a red flag. So journalists in general tend to do that. They tend to follow that, even though they publish for these popular media. They still have to verify their resources, even though they may not disclose them in such as in newspaper or magazine articles. That's just a criteria of journalism, right? They have to check their sources and verify. Accuracy is very important. You do not want to use a resource that's questionable, that is inaccurate. And the last letter there, P for purpose. What is the intention of the resource that you're being exposed to? Think of politics, right? We had an election last year. There was a lot of information. There was a lot of pamphlets, flyers, advertisements, commercials, you name it, right? On social media, especially, that was to help you decide who to vote for. So the purpose was political. The purpose was to convince you. Sometimes it's to sell you something, right? Especially commercials. You see advertorials or advertisements in some of these magazines. It's a commercial for a new medicine. The purpose of that, and it may have some statistics, it may have some facts, but the purpose is to sell you it. Being mindful of that, the intention of the information that you're reading is very important. That is the CRaap Test that is commonly used by college students to help them evaluate their sources. Bias. I think this one's a difficult one because sometimes we just don't know when we're biased. Sometimes we're so used to our environments, our resources, our authors, our favorite channels, our news networks, for example, that we fail to see some of these biases. And the biases can be very subtle. So here's information to help you decipher more about biases. So it reflects a partiality, a preference or a prejudice for or against a person, an object, or an idea. There's a selection of facts, choice of words, and the quality and tone of description to convey a particular feeling or attitude. You probably have heard of this sometime before in your schooling. Maybe a teacher or so in a class has said this, that it's impossible to be totally neutral. We all have biases, right? It just depends on what degree we have them. And so it's important to know how to identify and analyze and use biased information. So one way to do this is to make sure you consult a variety of resources. It can be very specific. It depends on whatever topic, right? But if we think about politics, since I mentioned that earlier about the election last year, if you're trying to find out information on how to be a more informed voter, then a good suggestion may be for you to consider sources on both sides of the aisle, right? In this case, both major political parties. And there may be others. There may be other PACs, for example, or organizations or boards that give out additional information in support of or against, or just additional information. And if you're consulting some of these resources that are not provided from your usual mainstream, then that may be a good way to have some kind of balance, right? You have some from this side and some from here. You have some sort of balance so that then you are able to decide for yourself. Bias can be tricky, but it is an important factor to consider. And here we provide you through this slide a couple of resources that I'm not going to click on, but that you could hopefully copy and use. One is Media Bias Chart. There's the website for that. Now, I haven't used that one myself. Allsides.com. Media Bias Fact Check. I've heard of that one before. And there's probably several more. And what these websites tend to do is they tend to give you the facts of the issue that you're searching for, or the topic that you've searched for in their website. And then they give you additional information that may be considered bias or whatever spin that it may be. So that's why intention, the topic, the factor that we were talking about a couple of slides ago about, are they trying to sell you something? Are they trying to persuade you? Are they trying to, that's why that finding out what the intention is very important, because that way then some of these biases could be more visible. That could be a good way of doing that. But nonetheless, if you want some of these websites, let us know and we can send you them via email if you wish. But if you're still not sure, we are here to help you. You can give us a call. You can write to us through email. Sometimes using Zoom could be very useful because we could share the screen and you could see what we're doing, or vice versa. You could share your screen and we can see what you're doing, and there you may be missing a step. I helped a student last month and that was exactly the case. So Zoom could be very helpful for that. We have live chat called Ask Us. There's our website down there. We're available primarily Monday through Friday, 8 to 5. But don't be surprised if you hear from us after hours as well. Many of us are dedicated professionals. And if you ask a very interesting question, you just may get a response after these hours. Just know that there's a variety of ways to get a hold of us. We're here to help you. We want to see you succeed. We are a service for the whole campus. And spring is here. Like all good presentations, written assignments that staff, faculty, and students right? At DACC, we should be showing our resources. And so this slide does exactly that. These are some of the resources that Susan Bontley used in creating this presentation. And she's also created additional supplemental handouts as well. She may have covered it already, or it's to be in the next presentation, but citing your sources. This presentation was on evaluating your sources. So the next presentation is probably going to talk about how to cite your sources, ones you do use. Do not use sources that you do not use. Instructors are very smart and they'll know if you are just putting things in the bibliography to make it look nice, okay? We want to make sure we use everything that we cite and vice versa. So in closing, we have focused on a couple of things here about identifying resources that are available, how to evaluate them using various tools, and how to check for biases. Thank you for attending today's presentation. Next Wednesday is the last in the series at 2 o'clock. It's on citing. Okay, I was right. How to cite your sources. And you want to contact the ARC tutoring, the ARC, to register just like you did today. Thank you very much for joining us. It's been a pleasure. There's the link at the bottom here of a survey. If you wouldn't mind doing us a favor and filling this out, it provides us with assessment information to help us improve these. Spend a couple more minutes, and it doesn't have to be right away, telling us how this presentation was for you, and then you just submit it, and then we get this feedback. Thank you very much. You all have a wonderful rest of the day.